The dust settled on September 19th. It coated the sagebrush, the wagon wheels, and the silent figures of Anna and Sarah. They were 17. The last wagon of the train, the one carrying the town's preacher and his family, was now just a dark speck shrinking against the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. It did not look back. Beside the sisters, their German shepherd, Wolf, sat on his haunches, his head cocked. He let out a low whine, a sound that was swallowed by the wind. They were alone. The town of Prosperity, a small collection of hastily built log cabins huddled in the valley floor, had cast them out not with anger, but with a quiet, collective pity that felt far crueler. Their father, a man of strange ideas, had died of fever 2 months prior, leaving them with nothing but a half-built, failing cabin, a wagon with a broken axle, and an idea. An idea the town considered madness. Wood rots, he used to say, his voice rough from the dust. Wood burns. Wood lets the wind in. The mountain is patient. The mountain is strong now. The wind was already testing the shoddy cabins below, a cool whisper promising a brutal winter. Winter was already watching the valley, quiet, patient. Anna looked at Sarah. No words were needed. They shared the same thought, the same inherited stubbornness. They looked not at the town, nor at the disappearing wagon, but at the granite face of the eastern ridge that caught the morning sun. It was a solid wall of stone and earth, ancient and unmoving. Their father had pointed to it often. He had made drawings in the dirt. The townspeople saw a barren cliffside. The sisters saw a promise. They saw a home. They had one good pickaxe, 2 shovels with sturdy hickory handles, a sledgehammer, a plough horse, and a dwindling supply of flour and salted pork. It was not enough to survive a winter in a cabin. It was not enough to survive a winter in Prosperity. But it might be enough to survive a winter in the mountain. The decision was a silent pact. A shared glance. A slow, determined nod. Sarah picked up a shovel. Anna gripped the handle of the pickaxe. Its weight was familiar, comforting. They would not beg. They would not fail. They would dig. They abandoned the skeletal frame of their father's cabin without a second thought. It was a monument to a failed method. He took the wagon. He took the plough horse. They dragged the broken vehicle, loaded with their meager possessions, to the base of the eastern ridge. The spot was carefully chosen. It was south-facing, destined to receive every precious minute of winter sunlight. It was sheltered from the prevailing north wind by a stony outcrop that jutted out like a jawbone. Below it, a small creek, already running low and clear, promised water until the deep freeze came. The ground here was a mix of soil and scree, the mountain's discarded skin. They spent the first 2 days clearing the area, creating a flat, workable space. On the 3rd day, the real work began. Anna, the stronger of the two, swung the pickaxe. The first strike was a dull thud, biting into the compacted earth. The second was a jarring clang as it hit stone just beneath the surface. This was the test. If it was solid granite all the way down, their plan was impossible. She swung again, and again, aiming for the same spot. A rhythm was born. Swing, clang. Swing, clang. Sarah worked behind her, clearing the loosened dirt and rock with her shovel, piling it to the side to form what would become a protective berm. Wolf lay nearby, watching, a furry sentinel against the silence. By midday, they had made a shallow dent, no more than a foot deep. Thomas, the town's carpenter, rode by on his horse, pausing to look at their strange labor. He was a practical man who believed only in what he could build with a saw and hammer. "What in God's name are you girls doing?" he asked, his voice thick with condescending concern. Sarah paused, wiping sweat from her brow with a dusty forearm. "Making a root cellar," he guessed, a smirk playing on his lips. Anna didn't stop her work. "Swing, clang." "We're building our house," Sarah said, her voice flat, devoid of any need for his approval. Thomas laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "A house? You'll be digging your own graves before the first snow." That mountain will be your tombstone." He shook his head, a gesture of profound pity, and rode on, the story of the mad sisters already forming on his tongue. The sisters did not watch him go. They had work to do. They had a mountain to move. The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Their world shrank to the small circle of their labor. Their muscles screamed, then hardened into a state of perpetual ache. Their hands, once soft, were now calloused and raw, the skin split and bleeding around their fingernails. They wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt, but the friction was relentless. The pile of excavated earth and rock grew into a substantial wall beside the deepening cavity. The initial layer of topsoil and loose rock gave way to a more compressed, stubborn conglomerate of sandstone and shale. It was hard, but it was workable. The pickaxe found purchase, chipping and flaking away the rock in manageable pieces. They fell into a seamless rhythm, an unspoken partnership born of twinship and necessity. Anna would work for an hour with the pickaxe, her powerful swings dislodging chunks of rock, while Sarah hauled the debris away using a makeshift sled fashioned from the wagon's floorboards. Then they would switch. Sarah, smaller but with more endurance, would take over the pick, her strikes more frequent and precise, while Anna used her strength to clear the larger, heavier stones. Wolf was their clock and their guardian. He would rise and stretch when the sun was directly overhead, their signal for a short rest and a meal of hardtack and water. He would bark at the coyotes in the twilight, his deep chest echoing in the growing hollow, reminding them that the wilderness was always watching. They spoke little. The energy was too precious to be spent on words. Their communication was in the shared weight of a heavy rock, a past waterskin, a glance that said, "My turn." By the end of the first week, the hole was deep enough for them to stand in, sheltered from the wind. It was no longer a dent, it was an entrance. The air inside was still and cool, holding the ancient smell of damp earth. The townspeople, when they passed on the distant trail, would stop and stare. Their strange activity had become a local curiosity, a cautionary tale in the making. The whispers in prosperity grew louder. "They're digging for gold," some said. "They've lost their minds with grief," said others. None of them understood. They saw two girls scratching at a mountain. Anna and Sarah felt the mountain yielding. They were not just digging a hole. They were carving a life. By the end of the third week, they had tunneled nearly 15 feet into the hillside. The entrance was a rough arch, about 5 feet wide and 6 feet high, just tall enough to enter without stooping. The initial conglomerate had given way to a thick, consistent seam of sandstone. It was a gift. The rock was soft enough to be chipped away with the pickaxe and shaped with the blunt end of the sledgehammer, yet solid enough to be structurally sound. The air inside grew cooler and carried a perpetual silence, the sounds of the outside world muffled by tons of earth. They were now working in near darkness, their only light coming from the entrance and a single, precious tallow candle set in a niche they carved into the wall. The work changed. It was no longer about brute force, but about careful shaping. They widened the initial tunnel into a main chamber, roughly 12 feet by 12 feet. The ceiling was a gentle arch, a shape they instinctively knew was the strongest. The walls were uneven, marked by the scars of their tools, but they were solid. Stone remembered warmth. It held the coolness of the deep earth, a promise of insulation against the coming extremes of winter and summer. From this main room, they began to carve out alcoves. A smaller one to the right, just big enough for their 2 bedrolls, would be their sleeping chamber. It was deeper into the mountain, where the temperature would be most stable. On the left, they carved a larger space, sectioning it off with carefully stacked stones from the excavation. This would be the chicken coop. Its position near the main living area was deliberate, the body heat of the birds would contribute to the overall warmth of their home. The floor was the hardest part. They painstakingly leveled it, breaking up high spots with the sledgehammer and filling in low spots with gravel and sand from the creek, tamping it down until it was as hard and flat as a threshing floor. During one of their water runs, Sarah's shovel struck something different in the creek bank. It was not sand, not silt. It was a thick, grey, pliable substance. Clay. She called to Anna, her voice echoing slightly in the valley. They dug with their bare hands, pulling out great handfuls of the smooth, cool material. It was heavy, dense, and perfect. This was the key to the final, most critical piece of their home. This was how they would tame fire and bring it into the heart of the mountain. The fireplace was not an afterthought, it was the soul of the structure. They chose the rear wall of the main chamber, the deepest point of their excavation. Here, the rock was thickest. Using the pickaxe, they began the arduous task of carving out the firebox, a deep, rectangular cavity that would contain the flames. It was slow, brutal work. Sparks flew as steel struck stone. The ringing sound was constant, a blacksmith's anvil in the belly of the earth. While Anna carved, Sarah hauled flat, dense stones from the creek bed, choosing each one for its size and heat-retaining properties. These would form the hearth and line the inside of the firebox, protecting the softer sandstone from direct flame. They had discovered a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock above the firebox during their initial shaping of the ceiling. It was another stroke of luck, a natural chimney waiting to be utilized. The challenge was to direct the smoke from the firebox into that fissure, which was several feet back into the rock. They needed to build an angled flue. This was where the clay became essential. They mixed it with sand and water, kneading it with their feet until it had the consistency of thick dough. This was their mortar. Patiently, stone by stone, they constructed the chimney breast, angling it back from the top of the firebox towards the fissure. They used smaller, flatter stones to create a smooth, tapering channel. They sealed every joint, every crack, with their homemade clay mortar, smoothing it with their wet hands. It was an engineering challenge solved by instinct and observation. A fire inside a mountain was a dangerous thing. If it did not draw properly, the smoke would fill their home, poisoning them as they slept. The town blacksmith, a burly man named Jacob, stopped by one afternoon, drawn by the incessant ringing of their tools. He peered into the darkness of the entrance. "Heard you were building a forge," he said, squinting to see. "A fire inside a mountain? You'll choke on the smoke before you freeze." Sarah, her face and arms smeared with grey clay, simply looked at him. "It will draw," she said. It was not a hope, it was a statement of fact. 3 days later, the construction was complete. The moment of truth had arrived. With trembling hands, Anna arranged a small pile of dry twigs and kindling inside the new firebox. She struck a flint and steel, showering the kindling with sparks. A tiny flame flickered, caught, and grew. Smoke, thick and white, billowed out for a moment, filling the top of the firebox. Then, as the heat built, a current was established. The smoke wavered, then began to move, pulled backward and upward into the flue they had built. It vanished. They rushed outside. From the top of the ridge, a thin, pale plume of smoke rose straight into the crisp autumn air. It was drawing. Perfectly. They had done it. They had brought fire into the earth. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. With the shelter and its heat source secured, their focus shifted entirely to provisions. Winter in this valley was not a season, it was a siege. They needed enough food, water, and fuel to last for months, completely cut off from the outside world. Their first task was to harvest every last scrap from their father's neglected garden plot. The potatoes were small, the carrots stunted, but they were food. They spent 2 days digging through the hard soil, their fingers numb in the morning chill. They filled 6 burlap sacks. These they stored in the deepest part of their dwelling, where the cold, stable temperature of the earth would act as a natural root cellar. Next was fuel. They couldn't rely solely on the small fire for warmth, the mountain itself provided the insulation. But they would need fire for cooking, for light, and for morale on the coldest nights. They took their father's axe and the plough horse and ventured into the sparse woods on the valley floor. They did not take healthy, living trees. They were scavengers. They sought out the deadfall, the trees already felled by wind or lightning. For a week, they chopped and sawed, hauling the wood back to their entrance, stacking it in a long, neat rick against the rock face where it would be sheltered from the snow. The pile grew to be over 6 feet high and 20 feet long. It was a fortress wall of firewood. Their final and most desperate task was to acquire the things they could not grow or find. They needed grain, beans, salt, and livestock. They owned only one thing of value, a small, silver locket that had belonged to their mother. It was their last link to their past, to the life they had known before. Sarah clutched it in her hand as they walked into Prosperity's general store. The owner, a man named Martin, watched them with wary eyes. The whole town had been talking about them. He saw the dirt under their nails, the exhaustion in their faces. "We need to trade," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. She placed the locket on the counter. The silver gleamed under the lamplight. Martin picked it up. He saw the desperation, and he drove a hard bargain. For the locket, they received 2 large sacks of flour, a sack of dried pinto beans, a small bag of salt, and 6 scrawny laying hens. It was a robbery, but they had no choice. The townspeople watched as the 2 girls loaded their supplies onto the back of their old horse. They saw the chickens, crated and clucking nervously. They saw the girls leading the horse not towards a cabin, but towards a hole in the side of a mountain. The sight confirmed their beliefs. The girls were not just mad, they were doomed. They were digging a hole and filling it with food, like squirrels burying nuts for a winter they would never see. By mid-November, the world had changed. The vibrant golds and reds of autumn had faded to a uniform brown. The sky was a perpetual sheet of grey, heavy with the promise of snow. A biting wind swept down from the northern peaks, rattling the windows of the cabins in Prosperity and stealing the warmth from their poorly chinked walls. The townspeople huddled closer to their fires, feeding them constantly, watching their precious woodpiles shrink with alarming speed. For Anna and Sarah, the change was a confirmation, not a threat. They sealed the entrance to their home with a heavy door they constructed from the thickest planks of their dismantled wagon, insulated with packed dirt and old blankets. A small, high window, made from a precious pane of glass salvaged from their father's belongings, allowed a sliver of daylight to enter. The first snow arrived not as a blizzard, but as a gentle, silent dusting. It covered the valley in a blanket of white, softening the harsh landscape. In Prosperity, it was a beautiful terror, a reminder of the prison walls that were closing in. Inside the mountain, it was an event of quiet wonder. Anna and Sarah stood at their small window, watching the flakes drift down. They felt no cold. The earth around them, a massive thermal battery, held a constant temperature of around 54 degrees Fahrenheit. With the door sealed and a small, economical fire glowing in the hearth, the temperature in their main chamber was a steady and comfortable 68 degrees. The contrast was absolute. Outside, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees, then 15. Inside, they worked in their shirt sleeves. The air was still and warm. The chickens, housed in their stone-walled coop, clucked contentedly, their feathers fluffed. They had already begun to lay, providing a daily bounty of fresh eggs. Wolf, who in previous winters had shivered miserably in the drafty cabin, now slept soundly on a straw mat by the hearth, his belly full and his coat gleaming. The sisters established a routine. They tended the chickens, cooked their meals of bean stew and fresh bread baked in a cast-iron pot nestled in the coals, and spent their time mending their clothes and planning for the spring. The silence was no longer empty, it was peaceful. The darkness was not threatening, it was cozy, illuminated by the warm, dancing light of the fire. They had not just built a shelter, they had created a separate world, a pocket of warmth and life insulated from the deathly grip of winter. The great blizzard hit on the 12th of December. It came without warning, a solid wall of white that descended upon the valley and erased the world. The wind was not a whisper, it was a physical force, a malevolent scream that tore at the log cabins of Prosperity. It found every crack, every gap, every weakness in the structures built by men who had underestimated the power of the wild. Snow, driven horizontally by the gale, was as fine as sand and penetrated walls, piling up in ghostly drifts inside the houses. The temperature plummeted. It dropped to 0, then 10 below, then 20. By the second day, it was an unimaginable 30 degrees below 0. The world outside ceased to exist. It was a roaring, white chaos. The town was paralyzed. Families were trapped in their homes, the snow drifting higher than their doors, higher than their windows. The log walls, which had seemed so sturdy in the summer sun, were now conduits for the bitter cold. Frost coated the interior walls. Water froze solid just feet from roaring fireplaces. The immense consumption of firewood was unsustainable. Men who tried to venture out to their woodpiles found them buried under 10-foot drifts. Some became disoriented in the white oak just yards from their own doors and froze to death. Panic began to set in. The carpenter, Thomas, saw the roof of his own well-built home begin to groan under the immense weight of the snow. Jacob, the blacksmith, ran out of wood entirely, his family huddling together under every blanket they owned, their breath crystallizing in the air of their own living room. The confidence of the town, their faith in their traditional methods, was shattered in less than 48 hours. They were not pioneers taming the wilderness, they were frightened animals trapped in flimsy wooden boxes, slowly freezing. Their mockery of the sisters, their condescending pity, now tasted like ash in their mouths. They were the ones in graves. Graves made of wood and snow. As their fires died and the cold crept into their bones, their thoughts turned to the East Ridge, to the impossible hole in the ground, and the two girls they had condemned as fools. On the third day of the blizzard, with the wind still howling and the temperature at a life-threatening -35°F, desperation overcame pride. A small group of men, their faces wrapped in scarves that were stiff with frozen breath, set out from the buried town. It was led by Thomas the carpenter and Jacob the blacksmith. They moved like ghosts through a nightmare landscape, sinking up to their chests in the deep snow, fighting for every step. It took them 2 hours to cover the half-mile to the eastern ridge. They almost missed it. The entrance to the sisters' home was nearly invisible, a slight depression in a massive snowdrift, marked only by a thin, steady plume of smoke rising from the rocks high above, a detail no one had ever noticed before. They dug frantically with their frozen hands, clawing away the snow until they uncovered the top of the sturdy wooden door. Jacob pounded on it with his fist, the sound a dull, hopeless thud against the roar of the wind. They waited, shivering violently, their hope dwindling with every passing second. Then, they heard the sound of a wooden bar being lifted. The door swung inward. A wave of heat, thick with the smell of baking bread and warm earth, washed over them. It was so shocking, so impossibly warm, that they staggered back. Anna stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the soft, golden light of the fire. She wore a simple wool shirt and trousers, her feet bare on the smooth stone floor. Behind her, they could see the main chamber. It was calm, peaceful, and bright. Sarah was by the hearth, kneading dough on a stone slab. The chickens were clucking softly in their enclosure. Wolf lifted his head from his spot by the fire, regarded them with intelligent eyes, and laid his head back down. The men stared, speechless. They saw not a damp, miserable cave, but a sanctuary. A living, breathing home, thriving in the heart of a storm that was killing them. Thomas, his beard caked with ice, his face a mask of shame and disbelief, finally found his voice. It came out as a ragged croak. "Please," he stammered, his pride utterly broken. "We were wrong. Our children, they're freezing." He did not need to say more. The desperation in his eyes, the defeat in the slump of his shoulders, said it all. Anna and Sarah did not hesitate. There was no recrimination in their eyes, no triumphant "I told you so" on their lips. Their vindication was not in words, but in the undeniable reality of the warmth that poured from their home. They simply stood aside and gestured for the men to enter. The group stumbled in, bringing a swirl of snow and frigid air with them, but the cold was instantly swallowed by the immense thermal mass of the surrounding earth and the steady heat from the hearth. The men unwrapped the scarves from their faces, their skin a painful, mottled red and white. They looked around in complete awe. The air was dry and fresh, testament to the fireplace's perfect draw. The walls of sandstone glowed in the firelight, absorbing and radiating a gentle, even warmth. It was more comfortable than any of their homes had ever been, even on the mildest of winter days. "Go back," Anna said, her voice calm and direct. "Bring the women and the children first." Follow the rope we will stake out. Do it quickly. She and Sarah had already prepared for this. They handed the men a long coil of rope and several wooden stakes. While the men were gone, the sisters made space. They moved their supplies to the back, clearing the main floor. They laid down extra straw mats and blankets. They put a large pot of water on the fire to heat. The first family to arrive was Jacob's. His wife, Mary, carried their youngest child, a blue-lipped toddler wrapped in a thin blanket, while their two older sons stumbled behind her, their faces numb with cold. When they stepped inside, Mary burst into tears, a ragged, painful sound of overwhelming relief. Sarah took the child from her arms, wrapping him in a warm blanket and placing him near the fire. Soon, others followed, a grim procession of defeated families emerging from the white fury of the blizzard. The small mountain home filled with the people of prosperity. They huddled together, children sleeping near the hearth, their parents watching the two sisters with a reverence usually reserved for preachers. Thomas sat on a low stone ledge hewn from the wall, watching Sarah methodically shape loaves of bread. He, a master carpenter, had built with wood his entire life, fighting against the forces of nature. These girls had not fought nature. They had partnered with it. They had listened to the mountain, and it had given them shelter, not just for themselves, but for them all. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, but inside the earth, there was only warmth, safety, and the quiet, profound strength of two sisters who had chosen to dig instead of despair.